Hello, Silas here. I don't know if we should be doing these intros anymore, but I'm here with my friend Steven. Say what's up to the peoples.
Hello, everyone. I hope all is well.
And we're going to be having a conversation about, Steven titled this conversation, The Battle of Vienna and the True Meaning Behind 9/11. And we are recording this on the 14th of September, 15th
15.
of September, which is shortly after September 11th, 9/11 in the United States of America. For those of you who are listening to this maybe in the future or are under, how, I guess this is a while ago. If you're under like, it's 2001. Actually, there's people who are like adults now,
Yeah.
technically adults that were born after it. But
Yeah.
that's when some people from some place in some place in the middle of the eastern areas like came into the United States. I'm laughing right now. It's not funny. They flew some planes into the Twin Towers in Washington, the Twin Towers in New York City, and then there was other buildings that fell down. We're probably not going to talk about Building 7 in this, sorry.
No,
But then
no.
there was also the situation with the Pentagon, and then a plane was taken down in Pennsylvania. This was one of the most, I think it's the biggest single terrorist attack that's occurred in the United States of America. And some people are trying to compare it with some other more recent activities. Quite not the same. But yeah, so we're going to talk about just the history behind that. And Steven's going to he's been looking into a bit more of his ancestral. Is this ancestral or cultural history? What would you say your connection to this is, to the Battle of Vienna and the Hussars? We'll spoiler. We're going to talk about the Hussars. Hussar. Is it
Well,
Hussars? Tell me how to say it right.
Hussars.
Okay.
So I did 23andMe probably about a year ago now. I found out I'm more Polish than anything else. I knew I had Polish background, but I wasn't sure how much because it gets complicated because that part of Europe with the borders shifting, like, some of those were independent city states. Others were part of the Holy Roman Empire. Some became parts of Germany. Poland itself actually moved basically all these different shifting things. So I was more Polish than anything else. I had posted something a while back, and I'm trying to remember. I think it was our friend Edward and also Mikhail who told me about. They told me about this whole thing, which we're about to discuss, about the Battle of the Vienna and the Winged Hussars and all that. So I started looking into it, and I think it's an important discussion because a lot of people don't really know about it, and they don't even know why 9/11 was picked as the date. Because I remember growing up, my mother told me it was because it was making fun of our emergency number 911, but that's not actually why. I think that's just a
Mhm.
misconception. So what happened was we'll get into the lead up to the battle itself, but the idea was that bin Laden wanted to succeed where the Turks had failed, basically, and the idea was if he had succeeded, he'd usher in a new age of Islamic supremacy. Obviously that didn't happen, but he picked 9/11 because that's when they had the greatest chances of winning this, and before the Hussars arrived and everything happened. um, so again, I think a lot of Central and Eastern European history doesn't get the attention it deserves. The lady and I recently saw Medieval. I don't know, you've probably seen trailers for that with Michael Caine.
No, I've not. But I don't watch a lot of TV. I'm also in Kenya, so if it's not like if somebody hasn't shared it in some social media group, I'm not catching it on day-to-day viewage.
Well, it's interesting because it's about one of the Czech national heroes. His name is Jan Žižka. We could probably do a separate discussion about this, but it's interesting because they say it's the most expensive Czech movie ever made, but the budget's only the equivalent of $20 million, which, like, to us is like there's individual actors who get paid that on by themselves. Um, but Žižka is one of the sort of unsung heroes where there was a reformer called Jan Hus who was kind of like, think of him as like a proto Martin Luther. Like, he tried to do what Luther ultimately succeeded in doing, like, try to speak out against the church and ultimately break from it. Now Jan Hus got burned at the stake, of course, because back then the church had a bit more leverage and was able to do that. And Zizka basically led a peasant uprising against not just the church, but all the different orders of knighthood that came in and tried to take over Bohemia, which is the modern day Czech Republic. And Zizka is really impressive because he basically commanded these armies of peasants. He was outnumbered every time, and he won every single battle that he was in. And it's interesting because, like, they say he's one of the few commanders who never lost a battle. Like, George Washington's considered one of our founding fathers. He actually lost more battles than he won. I think it was like, I was looking, it was like 6 wins, 7 losses, and 4 were draws or something. Um, which is crazy. But Zizka won every battle despite being outnumbered and despite commanding peasants against professional soldiers. And again, it can be a bigger discussion, but the movie gets into the tactics they used. Like he had these war wagons. It was almost foreshadowing the tank by about 500 years. There were different traps and things he would set up. So he and these peasants would just destroy these armored knights despite being outnumbered and despite not having the training. So I learned about Zizka from playing Age of Empires 2, and I thought it was cool that they finally made a movie about him. So I definitely recommend that if you have the chance. Reminds me of Braveheart a little bit, kind of like, the whole commoner kind of like fighting a much greater power and getting some victories. The movie only covers the earlier part of his career. I was hoping they'd go into the later stuff, but maybe there will be a sequel or something. We'll see.
With some of these characters, though, when you get into these things,
Yeah.
it's such an interesting time of history because I like to think that we're actually entering the beginning of actual history where we can actually hear things the way they were, where even it's not even hearing from the losers because the losers are going to be biased in a certain way, hearing from the winners are going to be biased in a certain way. Even if these two teams of people who are involved in the actual action are trying to give as true a telling of what happened,
Yeah.
by virtue of being in it, you're going to see there's certain parts you're not going to be able to see, other parts you're not going to be able to see, and then of course the rest of the world that's involved in it has other things to put into it. So you might have, I'm not just, some people might come, some Ziska supporters might come and say, oh, you're not, but there's a chance he might have lost some battles here and there that just kind of didn't get mentioned. Because at that time, there's still, when was this? What were the years of this?
This was I want to say 1400s. Yeah, because this was before the Renaissance. Like this was,
Yeah.
I don't know if it was a century or so before Luther, because he was, again, like different people tried to do what Luther ultimately did, but got burned for it. But then a combination of the church losing power and other people sort of exploiting the weaknesses in the church. That's why Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, all these other people were able to succeed, and that ultimately helped break the power of the church. Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm saying it's like how good were people actually keeping notes? Like if he had lost
Yeah.
a battle, because back then we're talking battles of a few thousand people. Like to have a massive army was like we were talking about the Roman legions. Roman legions were like how many people were like the Roman legions? Like 40,000 people.
Well,
Like that
I
was
know
like the entire legions.
a century at 100 guys. I mean, that's easy to remember.
Yeah, but
A
like I'm talking
century.
like the whole Roman Empire, like all the soldiers. It wasn't like China has 1 million soldiers, like 1 million people in the CCP's army, like the People's Army of China. United States of America probably has about 300 and something thousand enlisted people. Just the enlisted people, the people who would hold the guns and actually go out there. Not even talking about all like the people who are they talk about the head of the snake and the tail of the snake, which is like the people who are working in the supply chains, the people who are working in logistics, the people who are back at the base, people who would stay in the United States of America and be part of that war machine. That goes up to like the millions and millions. So that's one of the amazing things about wars back in the day when they're talking about these massive battles. It's like 40 people versus 40 people. And it's like a massive like historical battle that changed the way like humanity actually existed. And that's the way some of these things happen. So with some of these, they could be some situations where you're not necessarily hearing like even look at what's happening in Ukraine right now. Look at the coverage that we have of what's happening in Ukraine. Like just recently, there was this thing that happened where there was a part in Russia that in the Ukrainian in the contested area that the Ukrainian army took back. And then you look at certain people like, oh my God, the Ukrainians surprised the Russians. You look at other people like there was never actually Russian troops there. Like the Russians just kind of moved out when the Ukrainians came in. But that thing itself, with all the modern technology, all the people looking at it, is being covered in such like Zelensky has this massive win, Putin is thrashed, and then some other people are just like, no, Putin's backing up, he's still gonna like win like the entire time. So those are the kind of things, the fog of war type of thing, it's bad enough just telling history of just things that happen day to day, let alone like the fog of war type of things. But these stories are meaningful, and I think there is something that I think is key here, and I think I might relate to this in some way from being more of like a third culture kid moving around and not really having that strong a connection to like the longer history. And with Stephen, when we met, he wasn't as aware of this because the 23andMe thing was how many years ago? 5 years?
I don't remember. Probably about that. Yeah.
Yeah, then he's actually gone in and looked into it more, but he's always been introspective. I think he's always liked history. He's always liked looking into these things and
Yeah.
seeing the connections about the way things come together. So I think he has an added impetus for his personal connection to it. And it's for some people, and that's why when we say like the key thing was understanding of why Osama bin Laden was doing it on that one day, why certain people have certain connections to it. And I think a lot of people in the West don't really have, I'd say probably specifically in the United States of America, in more urban areas who have traveled around in their personal lives, they don't have a strong connection to certain longer cultural histories to
Yeah.
believe and hold certain grudges. And that's why when people look at Europe and like, oh, Europe is just like the Euro, it's like the illiterati class, the suburban class, the cosmopolitan class in Europe, which is 10% of the population might think that way. But majority of the people still know, like a majority of Italians still have relatives that were killed by Germans. So it's not like
Yeah.
they're not just like, the Germans are okay. Like the British
Yeah. I
people,
was
like
gonna
the
say.
Queen. Go ahead.
Sorry. Well, I was going to say, I know you're not a fan of him, but Bill Maher was saying, I think it was to Ben Shapiro, that like a lot of Americans don't get that. This is why like Russia wants Ukraine because Ukraine
Yeah.
was where the Russian state was founded.
Uh-huh.
Milosevic, Serbia, he attacked when he did because that was the anniversary of a certain battle date. Again, 9/11 was picked for the reasons we're about to get into, but it's like people forget that like for these cultures that have been around so long, again, being American, this is a very young country. It's like
Yeah.
they sort of lose sight that this goes back hundreds of years and it's revisited year by year, and
That's the thing. I don't think people don't really imagine like that date would mean that much to anyone. They can't. It's harder for some people to realize. It's even harder for me. Like for me, like with Stephen going into this, I haven't really found something where I feel that personal, strong, personal connection to this particular thing. Although I like following different storylines. That's why when Stephen brought this up, I was like, yeah, this sounds like something cool to talk about. Because like here with Nairobi, Kenya, I'm from the Luya tribe. We don't really have that long of a written history with these are the Bantu peoples. They live in that certain area. There's some more modern day tribalism, like the person who was running for president, Raila Odinga. He lost to William Ruto, and Raila Odinga was from my tribe, so there was some tribal connections in that kind of level. But it's strange because it doesn't have the strength of tribalism is as strong as it probably was back when John Ziska was living, but we don't have that written history to go back to that. It's more like something that was more current. So it's an odd thing. It's not as strong here, and we have a situation where my parents' generation was very strong into this, and of course people who still live in the countryside. But my generation below, who are living in Nairobi and the major cities, they're really beyond that. Like they've skipped that level of nationalism to go into more like an international type of mentality where you're getting a lot of information from the internet and these things and becoming more like a global citizen or understanding is actually a more African identity than there is a Kenyan identity, than there is a tribal identity for, I think, the younger type of cohort. So there's interesting things happening in the world, but these kind of histories are things that used to really strongly inform certain places and still strongly inform a lot of people. Like the Queen just passed, the Queen of England,
yeah,
Queen Elizabeth, and just thinking like she was 96. 95% of the British people did not know any other queen but her. Like she was the only ruler. And then now you're talking about will King Charles now be able to actually maintain these things? Because the generation that had that affinity is gone. So
yeah.
to just transfer that over. So there's certain things where it's interesting to see how some of these things changed. It's interesting to see how some people were like mythologized at some time. I wonder how many of the average Polish people, like day-to-day Polish people, do you think? I know the Poles are thought of to be more nationalistic with Hungary and those kind of countries, but how much do you think John Ziska would be if he just walked in the street in Poland? How many people do you think would know this stuff we're about to talk about?
Well, Jan Žižka was Czech, but I know he's considered one of their national heroes. But what I was going to say too is it's tough because the thing is, like, I don't know what percentage of the population here is Czech, but I'd imagine it's much smaller because I was reading that Slavs are one of the most numerous populations here, mostly Poles and Russians, and of course you have some like Belarusians and whatever else. But it's like there isn't really a lot of emphasis on Czech history except in relation to other things or
Mm-hmm.
if you're Czech yourself, obviously. So, for example, I was thinking of the whole appeasement in the Sudetenland during World War II about like, okay, this was given to Hitler, this is peace of our time, but like that was probably the most I learned about Czech history in school because it's seen as not relevant. They want to focus on the Anglosphere, Western Europe, all that, and then obviously the American Revolution and everything.
Yeah, I might check. I might take a note down to see if we can check this. I will be going and check it. There be any listings for Czech history books in school. So if anybody happens to be listening to this that is Czech or knows anyone in Czechoslovakia, no, is it just not
Czech
Czechoslovakia anymore?
Republic.
Yeah, it's Czech Republic
No,
now. Slovakia is a
yeah.
different. So now would the Slovaks also have some connection to this, or was that like a different kind of peoples now?
I'd have to go back and look because the kingdom was originally Bohemia, and then Slovakia was one country. But then
Hmm.
they basically decided like we can't get along. Let's go our separate ways. So the Czechs went to the west, the Slovaks went to the east. But I'd have to see where the kingdom of Bohemia is. But I know it's in that general area.
Yeah. So if anybody has been to school then or knows anybody in that place who might know about how like the average this is K through 12 when they would teach something like this, or maybe in college. I'm sure if you took some college courses about the history of the people in those areas, you probably get something like this. But yeah, yeah. So
I just had
what?
two more
Right,
points I
yeah.
wanted to make. It was interesting about the history of Britain because I saw something on it was a tweet on Twitter and I hadn't thought about this till someone pointed it out, but I thought it was really interesting that um, Elizabeth actually came into power when Winston Churchill was still in power. And the thing was, Churchill was a member of parliament when Queen Victoria was still alive. And
Oh
Queen
wow.
Victoria was actually born when King George III was still alive. And if you think about it, that's all of American history, those few rulers. Yeah.
Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And then,
America's
sorry, go ahead.
relatively young when it comes to. I mean, okay, well,
Yeah.
this developing take outside of the developing world, outside
Yeah.
of the colonial, the pre or the post-colonial countries, America might be
Yeah.
one of the youngest ones in the world. I think.
Yeah, and then the other point I was going to add, talking about accuracy, that always comes up with Braveheart. Like Braveheart's always like a fun, entertaining movie, but most historians admit like the accuracy is completely out the window. Because the thing is, they say with
Yeah.
William Wallace, well, because with William Wallace, all we really know about him was there was a poet called what was it, Blind Harry or Henry the Minstrel, and he wrote about him after his lifetime. So it's like, how accurate is that? Then we're basing what we know of him off of that. So they took a lot of liberties, like for example, like spoiler alert, but like him having sex with like the princess of France, but then like in real life like she was a kid during that time and they never met, and like there's all these different creative licenses. But I mean, Braveheart's meant for entertainment, it's not a documentary.
Yeah.
So
But that's also kind of what history was before. Like history was
yeah.
more, it was actually more like his story. Like I know some
Yeah.
people try to say, oh, it's patriarchy and it takes women. No, no. I mean, it was more like, yeah, that was his story. It's his story about what happened. Like history was actually closer to your truth. My truth was just your truth.
Mm,
Like the way some of the regressive people say now. I think it was more that kind of thing. It wasn't actually the
yeah.
truth. Because now we get to the point, like I was mentioning, we are getting to a point where finally we actually be able to tell actual history, where people were like, this is what was happening, this is what people were saying about what was happening, this is what people weren't even aware of that was happening behind, and then we'll be able to actually see that. And we're seeing like history, like how many times has something come out? Like if this was back in Jan Ziska times, the Ghost of Kiev would have been would have been the thing. Where I remember Ghost of Kiev came, how many of those little
Yeah.
things just popped up for a second and then just were like completely knocked down?
Mm,
Snake Island popped up for a second, completely knocked down. Like those things just used to pop up and down, up and down, up and down. But back in the day, they'd pop. A few people would catch it. Then all of a sudden, 10 years later, it was some mythical being that did this and that and this. And so it's interesting to see. So yeah. So what else about this particular person I reached out to made you feel like, okay, let's talk about this guy or this story,
so
this topic.
well, so this, in general, I just love stories where people have the odds stacked heavily against them and manage to win. So there's a song, the Winged Hussars. There's a Swedish metal band called Sabaton, which is I'm a big fan of now. I sent you a link to their song about this, and it's kind of become a thing in certain pockets of the internet. It's called Winged Hussars, and there's a line, "When the Winged Hussars arrived," and the thing is, people have made like these funny things where like someone will be walking and then they'll play that, and then like an animated hussar will come out of nowhere and like run the person over or something. So they have a really good album. It's called The Last Stand. I was listening to some more stuff from that recently. Basically, the album is about you can probably kind of figure it out, but it's like people that were heavily outnumbered and they either put up a fight before going down or they won. So like he talks about the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. He talks about the Hussars. He talks about Allied soldiers at Normandy. They talk about the album itself is named after the Last Stand of the Swiss Guard. I don't know if you know about that, where there were 500 Swiss guards protecting the Pope, and basically they stayed behind and protected him so he could escape, and only 42 remained. So to this day, they still use the Swiss guards, and they're sworn in on like the date of that battle because it was like 500. Rome was basically in chaos. They basically held off the advancing troops so the Pope could escape. The 42 that survived escorted the Pope to this castle, but then it's like the rest just got wiped out, but they took down a lot of soldiers in the process. So basically, like those kinds of stories. And this was how I first started to get into this, but then I started looking into stuff on my own, watching things on YouTube. There's been one movie made about it. It's in Europe. I think it was made in Poland. Unfortunately, it's kind of hard to access in the US because I saw you can. I tried looking at it from Netflix, but they said in Netflix it's not available in your country. I tried looking at it from Amazon; it said the same thing. I saw there was a Catholic group that pushed to sell the DVD of it, but it's like I don't have a DVD player. I don't even have a drive on my computer. I'm hoping there's a way to access it. I mean, you could probably find it off some like bootleg site. I don't know. I'm kind of wary about some of those sites though, because they put stuff on your computer, and I don't want to mess around. So,
Yeah,
but
be
I
careful
would
on the
like
high
to actually.
seas.
Yeah. I mean, I would like to watch the movie at some point, but I don't want to like go on one of these shady sites and my computer's messed up. So,
Yeah. Yeah, but as you're mentioning also with the upcoming cinema, I think that's one of the positive things that's happening. There's a lot of people who are distraught, a bit upset about certain things that are happening in Western media in Hollywood, and it's a captured media. It's always leaned. It's leaned left in general for some time, but not
yeah,
as stringently as it has been. And they're
yeah,
still about making money, so it'll take some time for them to realize what they've been doing with some of the
yeah,
social justice messaging that they've been doing, which I think is more just them not being in touch. Because when these people get into that Hollywood bubble, the people at top who are making the decisions are listening to the people who are below who are saying, yes, these are the things, we've gone to these schools, we've studied these things, these are the numbers that we're doing. And the amount of money that goes in there, and also there's some things of some money laundering. Like some of these things are just like the amounts of money, like you mentioned, 20 million was spent on this movie. That's like a massive movie for Poland, but this is just like typical things. The amounts of monies that are just thrown around for some of these productions, it's crazy. Um, but so
because well,
in,
well,
in
because it was the Czech Republic, but yeah, 20 million in total. And I was reading that like Leonardo DiCaprio's had movies where he gets paid 25 million just on his
yeah,
own, and then that's not adding
just to show
everything
up.
else.
Yeah, not even like
Yeah.
the residuals
And,
and all this other kind of things.
And
And so
I
with
was reading when so one other point. Sorry, I was also remembering that when the Patriot was being made, they wanted to cast Kevin Spacey in it as well, but they said they couldn't afford it because I think Gibson was already getting paid like the 20 million or whatever, and I think he would have wanted the same. So they had to get I think his name is Jason Isaacs who played Tavington because they could afford him, but it was like you had two guys that each wanted like double what
yeah,
that movie costed.
yeah, and I think one of the things I normally tell people is like, okay, people are like some people are, oh, we need more black representation. Oh, we need more like Asian representation. But there's industries, there's movie industries, especially when you talk about Asia. There's movie industries in China, there's movie industries in Japan, there's Hong Kong cinema, which I guess is part of China to some extent. If you want the Bollywood type of stuff, there's crazy stuff coming out of Bollywood, of course, like Slumdog Millionaire, stuff that kind of made a crossover. But there's other just typical
Yeah,
stuff that's in there. I think even like the smaller countries will have that. Like if you are a Vietnamese American and you're not like first generation, like if you multi, you can actually go back and find stuff that's being made in your country. If you're someone who's African American and maybe you feel like you have some still connection to Africa and you want to see some of those stories, there's industries coming up, and that's one of the positive things happening. Because at the same time, I tell them like, oh, just go to other countries. But that's also the people who want things to stay. Oh, Hollywood needs to cater us. In my estimation, I don't think anyone needs to cater to you, and I don't like people pushing their messaging.
yeah,
If you're making entertainment, make entertainment to entertain. Whenever you start going
yeah,
away from entertainment in an entertainment medium, you're going to kind of go away from it. You could have messages in entertainment, of course, but the positive
yeah,
thing about this technology is getting cheaper and cheaper. The ability to actually make these products and these productions is getting better and better. If you are somebody who wants to see stories being told more that appeal to you, try to just put in a bit of effort instead of just expecting Hollywood. Like Steven mentioned, this movie that came out. Instead of just expecting movies to come out and you know about them, go out online. If you're listening to this, you have access to the internet. Search out stories that you like. if there's characters that you like from certain areas, check those countries. They might actually be making productions there. You might actually be able to crowdfund and help them and invest and help somebody in some other country, in some other place, or somebody in your country make a product, a production that is more tool to you, like you can actually participate in it. Like Zanziska was doing, was combating these millions of people. He's combating these people in these stages. All you have to do is sit there and send some money to somebody, or sit there and do a search and get some actual information. So don't just sit there and complain that nothing's being made for you or people are changing the things that you like. So yeah, just there's a bit on that.
I was going to add too, I don't know if you ever saw it, but there was the movie Mongol about Genghis Khan, and it was cool because it was actually made by Mongolia, so it's like in their language with subtitles. I think the director was Russian. I only saw part one. I guess it was shut down, but apparently they've resumed production and they're going to do parts 2 and 3. So the first part is basically him sort of as a kid in his rise to power, uniting the tribes, and then I think it ends with like him sort of going into China. Then the next ones are going to be about conquering China, Persia, going into Europe. So like something like that. But I think you're going to see more things like this, like things come out of the countries themselves where they're going to say, look, this is our national hero. This person made a big impact. Let's make a movie ourselves to show what they did, and then hopefully that'll spark interest from other people too. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
definitely because a lot of these Hollywood productions are already done. Like most of these things are done in other countries, so the setting and the talent to actually make some of these things is already there. The cameraman, the crew, and for people already there in those countries. I've seen some people trying to expand, like here in Kenya. I think we'll do that later, get more into storytelling, try to find some people here in the Kenyan industry that are more involved in actual movie production, animation production, and telling their stories and things like that. That's something that's there, and these stories can appeal to people. And this is one of the things. Like, I don't think it's that creative what's happening in the West right now. They're like, oh, we need to reflect the world the way the world is today. It's like, no. In general, I think when you're telling a good story, you tell a story that works within the story itself. Like things make sense within that story. They don't have to be 100% reality, because if it's 100% reality, you just got to live your life. Why do you need this? Or you can watch a documentary or something. But if you're trying to make this imaginary universe match your truth of what your lived experience is, by definition of it being your lived experience, it might not necessarily appeal that much to that many other people outside of you. If it's your truth versus some truth, or versus a truth that fits in this universe, it's not necessarily going to fit. There's certain things that in movies, in shows, in creations, in creativity that don't necessarily have to apply to what you consider to be reality and sense. I don't know. It's tough, but yeah.
And again, I get it. I mean, like, unless you're Czech, you probably don't know who he was. I only learned about him from Age of Empires too. And then when I saw they made a
Yeah.
movie about it, like, oh, that's really cool. But I'm a history buff, so naturally I'm going to know a little more about this. But it's like, I know like they casted Michael Caine. He was the only actor I knew in it. But I mean, hopefully more people will see it. And like I say, maybe take an interest. I mean, but who knows? Huh.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then we can jump into actually discussing of
Sure.
this thing itself. Like, and as we mentioned, you got to realize that some of these things, these are big things and they have ramifications. Whether some of this stuff we're talking about is
Yeah.
100% what happened or not, do understand like
Yeah.
something like this actually does have a knock-on effect where, yes, he maybe would have done this action anyway, but why did he
Yeah.
pick 9/11? Like, to have something like this actually lead to something like that, for some people it might seem like, whoa, that's crazy that someone would still hold that date, but this means a lot to a lot of people. Not as many people today as it did back then, but
Yeah.
by virtue of it being this new date, has a lot of meaning and importance.
Sure. All right. So I'll get into sort of the prelude and what led up to this. So in the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire was starting to recognize what we now recognize as a state of their decline. They were losing territory to Russia and just weakening in general. Vienna, the capital of Austria, had been a long goal of conquest for the Turks, since it would have given them access to the Danube River, certain trade routes, and ultimately provide a staging ground to eventually go further into Europe, ultimately Rome. I mean, that was their goal for a long time. If we take Rome, the church falls, and then we can take over the rest of Europe. Um, the Turks had also been supporting other non-Catholic factions, like there were Protestants in Hungary, basically who would help them sort of sabotage the different European powers. The Holy Roman Empire and Poland, Lithuania were Catholic. I think this is an interesting point because people look at it as just Christians versus Muslims, and like the Middle East, it's the same thing today, like, oh, Jews versus Muslims, but like historically there were Arab Muslim tribes that would side with Jews against other Arab tribes and things like that. And it was kind of the case here too. Like there were Hungarian Protestants that were being crushed by the Holy Roman Empire, so they sort of rebelled against them, and then the Turks supported that. And then you had Tatars, which they often get confused with Mongols, but they're actually a Turkish people. There were some who fought for the Turks, some who fought for the Poles. So it's like, these different alliances, and there were also mercenaries who fought on each side. And, it's more complicated than people think.
Yeah, because
And
people
sorry,
also
you
need
had,
to understand,
yeah,
like, there was Christians in the Middle East. I know it might be tough for some people
yeah,
to imagine now, but the Christianity is a Bronze Age and
yeah,
Middle Eastern religion. So
yeah,
once upon a time, there was a significant number of Arab Christians, but
yeah,
some certain religions kind of pushed them out of the place, and now it's just like
yeah.
the small amount of Jews in Israel and then the neighboring places, but also in the inverse. With these inroads that were being made by these different faiths and beliefs and systems like that, there's a whole lot of Muslims in Europe. Is Caucasian. The Caucasus Mountains is like half Muslim, isn't it? Like we talk about Khabib Nurmagomedov and people like that.
Yeah.
Maybe a famous UFC fighter. His whole family is Muslim, and that's just because that's in the area. And these are the whole confluence of there. That's the thing. It's a supercontinent. The Asia in Europe, the Middle East is in there in the middle, of course. So it's interesting to see how some of these things kind of meshed up together.
Well, to this day, I mean, Bosnia and Albania are Muslim countries because of the Turks going through there.
Yeah.
Whereas the rest of them, some were Catholic, some were Orthodox, all that. Greeks have their own church and all that, but it was like some just converted to Islam, others just kept up with their faiths and practice in secret, or I guess in some cases the Muslims allowed them to practice, but they didn't have the same rights and everything by law.
The people of the book.
Yeah, exactly. So let's see. So Kara Mustafa Pasha, he was a Turkish nobleman. He was chosen to command the attack. He was a Grand Vizier. That was his title. Um, some people have speculated if the Sultan wanted him to command the attack rather than the Sultan go himself, because previously there was another attack on Vienna in the early 1500s, and Suleiman the Magnificent, the Sultan, actually commanded the attack himself. But some are wondering, did the Sultan send him because it was the idea of, okay, if this doesn't pan out as I want and he loses, okay, I can blame him. But then if it succeeds, I can say, well, this was my plan and take credit for it. So some people have kind of wondered that too.
How
Um,
common was that? The because I know back in the time was the night times. I know we talk about King Arthur. Like that's another thing we talk about King Arthur. That's going completely into the whole like myth time. That was when history wasn't even like attempting to be
yeah,
historical. It
yeah,
was just embracing myth. But there was a transition period there. But when in those Arthurian times, so those times we were talking about, the actual real world people in there, when they had the knights, it would be like the peasants. You'd have a war. I think you'd call upon your peasant folk in the area. So
yeah,
you'd marshal your 200 or so people. You'd have the keep or the castle would have some trained knights. So maybe you'd have about 5 knights in that castle. Then you'd have
yeah,
the castle's men. So you'd have some more people who are like trained in like regular kind of policing, who do policing kind of activities. So you'd have maybe like another like 25 to 30 or so who are actually trained soldiers and things like that. Then you'd go out and you'd have your battle with people. And the peasantry, yes, they'd be there with whatever weapons they would bring up for themselves and their pikes and things like that. A few of the armory in the castle that should be used. But then when the knights would fight each other, they would normally clear out some space. That's where like jousting and stuff like that. That was very close to what knights actually used to fight like in actual warfare when they're out there. It wasn't like a whole bunch of knights rolling towards knights and having these massive battles with all these peasantry around. It's like no, the peasantry would move around, create some kind of ring. The people would normally bash each other, and whoever would get injured would get dragged away. So in a situation like this, how common was it for an actual leader to be in the front lines, because they might go and have a tent and then be on, but not be on the actual front. So like with Jan Ziska, was he an actual considered a leader at that time, or was he more just like a
well,
heroic being? Like, he wasn't
well,
like a head of state or head of a king or something like that, was he?
well, Jan Žižka, by the way, that was a different era. This was 1600s. I was just bringing him up because that was 1400s.
Yeah.
I was just bringing him up because he's another sort of like unsung hero who fought hard and had all these crazy odds.
No,
He
I
was
get that,
actually
but I was saying like, was being like he wasn't an actual like political leader before he became a name through his activities in the war, right?
Well, so he was a mercenary, and the thing was, this is how he learned a lot of these strategies, because he would have to do things like ambush wagons or whatever, and he just kind of figured out like, how do I use the terrain in my surroundings and all that. And there was a lot of infighting. I know, like, Bohemia was weak. The king died without an heir. Hungary wanted to take it over. The Holy Roman Empire wanted to take it over. And if I remember correctly, different nobles tried to reach out to him, basically like, hey, support us, you know, we'll take care of you. But he disagreed with a lot of them. And of course, he agreed
Okay.
with Jan Hus about the church is corrupt and the governments are corrupt and I can't side with them. So he kind of went his own way. But he did have offers of like, okay, join me and I'll take care of you and I'll give you a title, and you know.
Yeah, so you wanted to be a champion. So there's definitely people who
Yeah.
do that, who'd become a noble through their actions on the field. But it was very hard for somebody to be a noble to begin with. There
Yeah.
was some transition time there. I'm not sure when it happened, where for you to be a noble and actually make your name on the battlefield post nobility or born
Yeah.
into nobility was not a common thing in my estimation. So here, when you're talking about the Kara Mustafa was chosen to command, that's somebody who, like, the leader was like, okay, the Sultan was like, okay, you go out and do it. Like, the chance of the Sultan riding in the front of these peoples back in the 1500s was that by then it was already kind of transitioning over, wasn't it?
Yeah, because I'll get into it later, but I know there was even a point when the right before the Hussar charge where the attack began and they basically hauled him out of there because it's like, you know, like the bodyguards even surrounded him, sort of like how like the Secret Service takes a bullet for the president. They kind
Mm-hmm.
of did that as well, where they would like surround him, and then if like a bullet or cannonball goes flying, it takes out one of them, but it like protects him. Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
So, yeah, I'll get a bit into the Polish king's background too, because that kind of reminds me of some stuff you had just said. Um, so the mess they tried to take Vienna multiple times. The last major attempt was in 1529 under Suleiman the Magnificent. Now, one of the reasons this attack had failed was because it was during the winter, and of course, back then fighting in the winter is a lot harder than it is now. Because I mean, you figure famously the Nazis tried to take over Russia, but they were delayed with the autumn mud, and then once winter set in, they were screwed. And back
Supply
then, this
chains
is
is the
even
key thing.
yeah, so you had supply chains, you had, of course, disease spread, you had getting the horses through the snow, and they said apparently the snowfall was in that winter in 1529 was even harsher than usual. So, of course, back then that was catastrophic. So this time the idea was, okay, let's begin the attack in summer and wrap it up before winter even gets here. And you know, Germany tried to do the same thing, but of course they got delayed, and then once autumn set in, like I say, with the mud, and then once winter came, that was it. Um,
They actually
and
still have the seasons. Like, I think even if we're talking about Afghanistan, it was like that's part of the objections to the drought was it was done right when they were starting a season or closing it. They should have if they waited just a bit longer, the season would have been done or something like that. And then even right now in the Ukraine war, we're coming up to winter, and people are talking about, okay, there's going to be a slowdown during the winter, and then it might pick back up. So yeah, there's still considerations to think of.
Well, there was something too that I was reading about with the Nazis where they invaded the Balkans because basically Italy tried to take them over and failed. So they basically invaded to sort of bail them out. And
Yeah,
the Nazis took Greece, and you know there's photos of them like flying a swastika flag at the Parthenon and all this. But some people were saying that this actually delayed the invasion of Russia, and had Italy succeeded, or they just said, oh well, we'll leave the Balkans alone, they might have taken Russia because they would have gotten to Moscow before winter. But because it stalled their attack, and then
because
if I
it got
remember
close.
correctly, yeah, and if I remember correctly too, they say the winter was also one of the harshest in decades. I mean, in Russia it's bad in
Yeah.
general, but they said it was like you took your glove off for a few seconds, your hands were frostbitten. Like that's how cold it was.
Or they got, like, was it 500 miles or was it 50 miles away from, like, the outskirts of Moscow?
It
Or
was
was it
pretty
St.
close. Like
Petersburg?
they said you could see through the city through binoculars. Like you could see the Kremlin through binoculars. So you know, really
Yeah,
close.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
so all right. So let's see what else here. So the Poland at this time it was the Polish and Lithuanian Commonwealth. They had united through a diplomatic marriage. I'll get into that in a bit. Um, they and the Holy Roman Empire, which today is like Austria, Czech Republic, part of Germany, those different city states. They signed the Treaty of Warsaw, which basically laid out that if Vienna was attacked, Poland would come to their aid, and then if Krakow and Poland was attacked, the Holy Roman Empire would come to their aid. So just sort of a mutual protection thing. Um, any thoughts or comments before I get into the siege itself?
It's just the same thing with the treaties, and
Yeah.
people need to understand how unusual the current treaties are, where it's like United States of America has 600 people stationed in South Korea. then supposedly have treaties like NATO, like
Yeah.
those kind of treaties of being like we were going to send people like oceans away to get you. Like treaties used to be like no, we're like right next to each other. Like we have completely we can see 100% why we're actually interested and invested into this treaty. So we're getting to a time when it's kind of questionable some of these treaties and agreements that are being held out that are currently in the world. I do think we are getting to a point. I don't imagine we're going to get to another massive world war again. I think we get to like a post-war type of civilization with the globalization where it's like, things are just so connected. Where there might be still more of these things like the Ukraine-Russia thing, where a country is still big enough and they say, okay, we're to take over this country for now. But then it comes back to once you've taken over the country, how are you going to maintain like the insurgency that's going to come up from it? It's going to be so tough to actually hold the country. And if the United States of America couldn't hold, I know distance-wise, this might be different with Russia and Ukraine since they're next to each other. But Ukraine is also a massive country if you actually look at it on the map. I just don't see how you could do these things. Like how the billions of dollars that were put into Afghanistan. You can't just go there and impose your will on peoples anymore unless you're willing to like scorched earth and just go in there and be brutal as all heck. But no country can really be that brutal with another country and still be part of the rest of the world. I don't think.
Yeah. No, because that was the whole point of the UN was that if something like Germany or whoever does something like that, other countries will impose sanctions, blockade, like other things to get them to stop. Basically, that was the whole idea. And because it's that, or you use super weapons, and it's like, especially today, it's like that would wipe out so many people. It's just terrifying.
It's not even like the UN going thing. I just don't think like the average Russian would keep, even when talking about these histories and things like that. Yes, people know like there's a history of where Russia was the Russian nationality, like the seed of what Russia is was in Ukraine areas, and that's also part of why Russia's not just like carpet bombing the major cities because those cities mean probably as much to many Russians as they do to the actual Ukrainians who are living there. But you have, at least historical wise, culturally wise, and things like that. That's what I mean. Of course, not the same because like people who are living there would actually die in the buildings. So there is that aspect of it. But to convince your people like this is something to care enough to support our leaders as we do this to other people. I think there's too much of the people actually relating. Just like I was talking about here in Kenya, like for Kenya to say, okay, now Kenya is going to bring an army up and we're going to invade Tanzania. There's not enough people, especially in the class that is more politically active, that you'd have to actually get people from that class to be in the military, get people to fund that military. Too many of those people have like businesses, relatives, and things like that. Know people in Tanzania, know musicians from Tanzania. Like they go to Tanzania on a regular basis because like the world has become informationalized and globalized. Where like with the Russians, most of the Russians who are complaining about this, it's not like oh we're getting actually bombed, carpet bombed. We're not worrying about this. Like no, we can't go to another country anymore. Like we like going to another country. We like doing these. So it's kind of a thing where I don't think any leader can convince their people enough outside of like North Korea, but not too worried about North Korea.
No. All right, so let's see. So the siege began on they marched troops basically through the Balkans up into Vienna. The siege began itself on July 14th, 1683. The operations themselves began about 3 days later. The Turks tried multiple ways to get into the city. They tried breaching the walls with cannons. I sent you a video. It talks about how the city was designed. They had these massive walls which had cannons on them, so it was really hard to breach. It's an interesting point in history because this is kind of the last you saw of this, like castles like this, because next century going forward, the artillery was so powerful, just blew through these. So this was kind of like the last era of like major castles and forts, you could say. So they tried different tactics. They tried scaling them with siege ladders. That movie I mentioned, they show a scene where they do that. They actually made it onto the walls, but they killed the soldiers who came up. They tried starving them out. They tried digging trenches below the city walls to blow up the walls with explosives underneath. And they try to, of course, do that, give an entry into the city. I'll get more into that below. So the commander was Ernst Rudiger Graf von Stauenberg, who commanded the garrison. It was 15,000 troops and about 8,700 volunteers, 370 cannons. The attacking Turkish force was about 170,000, so, outnumbered several times over. Some say the estimates varied. Some say it was higher if you include, like, the troops, the auxiliaries, scouts, and whoever else. But, there's different numbers. So the food supply to Vienna was cut, so soldiers were exhausted all the time. They said if you fell asleep on the job, you were shot. So, you basically were trapped in the city on rations. You had to stay awake. Yeah, it was really brutal. Um, the Turks tried to tunnel under the city walls and blow them up around September 8th. Fortunately, the Viennese garrison found out what they were doing. They dug under the tunnels. They killed the sappers and prevented it from happening. Um, of course, the other Christian nations basically knew what was going on here, so this put pressure on them. Like, okay, you guys have to come and relieve the city soon. All right, thoughts and comments? Yeah.
Yeah, just it's it's just like, again with the memories of just thinking of how like adverse childhood, or not even just adverse childhood, if something happens to you as an adult, you see something, you experience something, the amount of like therapy and assistance and handicap and PTSD that people would get from relatively day-to-day things. Somebody called me a word, and
Yeah.
then I did get this job, and now I'm like struck for the rest of my life. You need to be on disability. Like I'm special for like as of this, you need to treat me in a certain way. Like, oh, I can't believe you didn't call me a certain pronoun and things like this. Oh, you're not accepting my existence, and that has affected me, and that's something that carries on to me. And you look at some of these people, and it's like you might not think what they claim to be an issue is a thing. And I think in some cases they might argue that that's not the key issue. That's what they're claiming to be the issue, but that is more a symptom of an underlying thing, probably mostly from childhood that they're not necessarily facing. But for some people, you really not call them a pronoun and they freak out. Or a black person gets called this six-letter word that starts with N, and then they think that's enough for me to flip out and be violent. And like the type of things that human beings even today still have to live through, like you hear about what's been happening in not even Ukraine. Like Ukraine is getting a lot of coverage, but you hear what's been happening in the Middle East in certain wars. You hear what's been happening in Africa when we still had these like Joseph Kony was just the other day, but we have these warlords going around and doing the type of just depravity that these people would go through. And then here you have this in the 1600s, and just the typical type of things that people would have to deal with and live through. And it's crazy because you look at an animal and you see some Discovery Channel thing, and I saw this one thing in the Discovery Channel, this lion kind of getting gored by this buffalo. The buffalo just kept goring it, and the lion just kind of, and then the lion finally, like he was still trying to fight back, but it was just so beat up, and then just kind of just lay there and just like, is that lion gonna make it back? You kind of think like, okay, the things animals can work through. Then I saw another thing. It's like a troop of baboons was having war with some other ones, and then they kind of flooded into the territory. It was like hundreds of them, and then they lost, and then they kind of got chased away. And then there was one that was just like running back with like the bone sticking out of his arm, just completely dragging its leg. It was going back with its peoples, but like nobody was like, there's no like medics like dragging it back. It's like they're gonna probably go and die. But that used to be life, because humans are just animals, and just the type of trench warfare, like even just World War I, World War II, but even just like this stuff, it's hard to really understand how gruesome life was for the day-to-day basis of these people, and then the things they had to exist with and live through. These people were still thinking, we're still going to have kids. We're still going to care about our family. We're still going to try to be better people. We're still going to work through. They didn't just like give up and like, oh, we need somebody else to do this for us. So it's crazy to think of the things that humanity has survived to get to this point. And it kind of shames me also personally, some of the things that I'm like, I can't do this. This is some of the things I went through. But yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy stuff.
Yeah, I'm sure you've seen that meme. I've shared it several times, or there's some version of it. Like child in the 15th century, I'm dying of plague. Child in the 19th century, I have to work 18 hours in a coal mine. Child in the 20th century, I have to fight in a world war. Child in the 21st century, I'm offended.
Yeah, and that's how it's gone. And these people lived through these things, and so what part of why I look at history in a different way, in one of the contexts that does inform me about the things that they did, I'm like, think about the options. It was like, it's this or something else. It's like, compared to what? It's like this person who was horrifically abused as a kid, saw some horrific things as a kid, became somebody in power, and then they did XYZ. That's a consideration. Even with someone like Hitler, someone might clip this and say, I'm apologizing to Hitler, but I read the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. I understood why Hitler did what he did. I don't agree with what he did, but it makes sense that he did what he did, knowing the things about his childhood and his background and things like that. So that's something I think people need to same thing. I think if you listen more about Osama bin Laden, that's why we're reading these things, you might understand why this was a day that was significant enough for him to decide to do this as a thing, if he truly believed as he believed, which might be hard for us to truly understand. Somebody believes. If you truly believe, if you're truly the kind of person who believes in your truths, try to really imagine what Hitler's truth was. Imagine what bin Laden's truth was. Imagine what Joe Biden's truth is today, or Hunter Biden's truth is today for him to do the things that he's doing. Those are the things I think give me pause. And also that's part of why we're talking about with the storytelling. That's why I like storytelling, where you can try to communicate these other human experiences to other people. And I think even these people currently saying, I want to tell my truth and reflect my world to those other people through these stories, I can understand why they want to do it, but I still think they're completely failing at the means they're choosing to do it. They could tell their own stories, own fresh new stories, but yeah, that's back to this story. Yeah.
All right, so King Jan Sobieski III of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, he crossed the Danube River with his forces
I think it's
northwest of
Danube.
Vienna. Yeah. Oh, because in German, I mean, you pronounce the E's on the end, but I don't know. Is
Okay,
that like
because I'm saying from it's like Chopin or somebody. There's a song Danube. It's like there's a classical music song I really like. It's like they say Danube. I don't know.
yeah, because like we say Berlin, but it's Berlin, like things like that,
Okay.
or like
Okay.
or you say people say Porsche, but it's Porsche because you pronounce the E in
I
German on
say
the end.
Porsche.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's some word. It's kind of how like when people say some Spanish words, they'll say like a Latin accent. Sometimes I'll do that. Sometimes I don't. I don't know why. Yeah. Okay.
So Jan Sobieski III, Jan is the Polish or German version of John, like Jan Žižka, Jan Hus, just a popular name. Um, he united with the forces of the Holy Roman Empire, the different German city-states, Bavaria, Saxony, different name, not too important to know which ones here, as well as some mercenaries. So just a little bit about Poland, Lithuania. It's really cool. In Age of Empires, there's actually three major campaigns that you get to play, and they're sort of connected to each other. There's the foundation of Poland, Lithuania, and they get into how Lithuania was one of the last pagan areas in Europe, and they basically converted a combination of diplomacy but also pressure from the outside forces, because if they didn't, they would have been taken over by the Teutonic Knights who attacked them. They
Huh.
defeated them, but that was another case of, sort of amateurs defeating professional soldiers. So the Queen of Poland, who was Catholic, married, I think he was the Duke of Lithuania, but they basically united the two kingdoms by doing that. Um, I forget exactly when it changed, because this I want to say was like 1400s. By this point, though, Poland Lithuania was actually a commonwealth. It was actually a republic, and it was kind of interesting because the founding fathers, I guess, were influenced by this to a degree, because it was sort of limited voting rights, like only the nobles could vote. But so like the king was elected by other nobles from the nobles, basically.
Huh.
So I think they actually called it Golden Liberty. So it was the idea of like, okay, the people have a say, but only certain people, kind of like the idea of only property owners could vote here. It was a similar idea.
So his
Um,
kids weren't considered princes and princesses.
No, so what's interesting, and there's one of the scenes I sent you, they show how a lot of the other commanders, they kind of look down on Sobieski. They say he's not of noble origin, which wasn't true. He was. But the thing was, it wasn't like the Habsburgs or Stuarts or whoever, where it was this one bloodline ruling all the way through. It was like, okay, different nobles, and if different nobles would run for king, and the most popular one, of course, would get elected. So he was seen as kind of like a lesser noble. So I think it's the usual Hollywood thing if they're trying to present him as like up from nothing, but that's not really true. He was a noble technically, but
Okay.
he wasn't like from this long line of rulers or whatever. Like Braveheart kind of did a similar thing where they refer to him as a commoner, but they said in real life William Wallace actually was from a noble family and inherited some lands. Like he wasn't way up there, but like he wasn't a peasant either. So I think they're
Yeah.
just trying to like portray the whole rags to riches story. Um,
Hero's journey type of thing.
yeah, because if you read about Sobieski, he went to like the top schools in Poland. He spoke multiple languages. Like he was definitely educated and all that, but he was also an accomplished general, and that's one of the things that made him popular. Because of course, war heroes are always popular, and he had fought other battles against the Turks and other things. But one of the scenes I show you, the other nobles basically say they consider him unfit because he's not like a true noble or whatever.
Hmm.
So he was put in charge of the troops. It was called the Holy League. It was about 70 to 80,000 troops against the Ottoman 150,000 plus. Again, some people say the Ottomans were higher. The one of the movies said the Ottomans had 300,000 in total, but I think that's if you include like everyone in the area and going further back and everything.
I
Um,
think people need to start. It's I think some of these numbers is kind of hard for people to like grasp. I guess for
Yeah,
some Americans, if you think of like football stadiums and things like that, like
yeah,
you can think of something like that. But what's a good figure to kind of get people to understand how many people like 100,000 people actually is? It's a lot of people.
yeah,
That's the thing? It was attributed to Stalin. I don't know if it's true. Like, if you kill like 1,000 people, or if you kill one person, it's a crime, or it's a tragedy. If you kill 1,000,
yeah,
it's a statistic. If you kill 1,000,000, you're a
yeah,
god. So it's kind of
yeah,
that thing where I think it gets to a certain level where now this is when you're talking about when armies start getting to the point where that's the kind of thing like I don't think we're going to get back really to this point because even right now so far in Ukraine, I think they say maybe 50,000. I don't quote this, but I think it's definitely less than 100K. Ukrainians have died, but I think the total
yeah,
army I think was 300K total, so it could still be a significant chunk of it. I think the Russians are around 25,000 or less. It might be even 10,000 have died, if that. But when you hear numbers coming back from the United States of America, like okay, the 8 people that died in Afghanistan in that bombing was after the botched escape. That was the first people that had died in like 4 or 5 years.
yeah.
But like the total 20 or so years or in Afghanistan, it was something like I don't like. Let me actually just check. But it's a few hundreds. It's not like tens and thousands of people dying. So people, that's what I'm saying. Like the amount of death people are willing to just accept is is a lot lower than I think you can convince people. Like I don't think the kind of misogyny you'd have to take in order to get people behind stuff like this is very tough.
Well, I think it's interesting too because I remember talking to my old history teacher about the air forces in World War One versus World War Two, and the Red Baron shot down 30 something planes, which was like the
Yeah,
record
it
at
was
the
like a
time.
massive. It was like a, yeah, it was like a crazy. This is
But then in
30 people.
but then he made the point like how many planes were shot down in the first few days of the Battle of Britain, just like the opening few days even.
Yeah.
And then the top German ace was said to have destroyed 500 planes. Now a lot of them were on the ground and were obsolete, so it's like you can debate like what's the merit of that, but still it's like 500 versus 30, but it's like how much bigger were the air forces and how many more people saw combat and all that. So it's pretty interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to check here with the United States of America. Okay, so the numbers, civilian casualties in okay, civilian casualties in the war is different, but
Yeah.
this was as of September 2006. There have been 3,500 coalition deaths in Afghanistan. That was 2006. I don't know if you can find the date that's more recent. With 711 Operation Enduring Freedom and ISAF deaths, 2010 was the deadliest year for foreign military troops since the U.S. invasion in 2001. Um, Continuing that trend that occurred every year since 2003. So over time, so 2009 there was 7,000 explosive devices. So yeah, it's that's the range of it. United States of America, number of foreign soldiers killed in Afghanistan, USA was 2,355. But now, how
Okay.
many did they send over that entire the time that
Yeah.
this figure has actually been given? But yeah, so that's just something there. So 3,502. This was from 2006. So I'd say maybe double it since that, but 6,000, 7,000 people. That's still a lot of people, but it's that's like nowhere close to the amount of people used to die in these kind of things that we're talking about in these things. And also think about the amount of world population. If
Yeah.
you do inflation wise, like army wise, this having an Ottoman Empire of 1,500, like
Yeah.
150,000 plus. If you transfer that to today's figures, we're talking about like 1.5 million. Like you're
Yeah.
getting like a significant chunk of your healthiest, most active, most capable population members and putting them out there. So that's different. Like you look at percentage of population compared to army size, it got to a time where here it was just like it was crazy. It was like half the men were like
Yeah.
involved in the war. It's like it's crazy stuff.
Well, yeah, because I know with like the American Civil War, they said 500,000 to 600,000 died, but back then, like, what percentage was that of the U.S.
Yeah,
population?
it's a
Yeah.
massive amount. Yeah.
So, all right. So moving on, let me see here. So they formed, yeah, the Holy League. Okay, so he came up with a plan. There's one of the clips I sent you, he tells the nobles what he's going to do. So he's going to sneak atop what's called Kallenberg. That's a mountain right by Vienna, and they were going to go up in the dead of night. This was on September 11th. So the idea was at the top they'd set up their artillery, hit the invaders from up high, and then he would lead the charge at the head of the Winged Hussars. Now, what's interesting with Kallenberg is that there's no roads leading up it, so they had to actually go. They show this in the movie too. They had to go uphill, and there was actually a thunderstorm, so they had to drag artillery and horses up this mountain in a thunderstorm overnight and set it up at the top of the hill and get ready for the charge the next day. And it was crazy because they show in the movies like they're pushing cannons, and of course they're sliding in the mud. Like one cannon actually falls and like breaks like down the hill and stuff like that. So it's like drag all that stuff uphill in the thunderstorm during the night and then fight a battle the next day is just crazy. And my understanding is that the battle, they were very well planned, though. They made sure the soldiers were well paid, partially through taxation, which we oppose, but also they got funding from wealthy noblemen, bankers. Even the Pope himself actually put in money. They wanted to make sure that all the troops were united and well motivated, because you think about it, there were lots of tensions of Catholics and Protestants, who gets the loot, who should be in charge, all that.
Yeah.
The Turkish forces weren't as well organized, even though they had larger numbers, and this ultimately became a problem, because some of the people were just there because the Ottomans made them, other people were just there because they were paid to, etc. Um, on the way to the city, the Christian forces found 30,000 civilians, including women, children, even infants, that were impaled and decapitated. Basically, it was the Ottomans trying to get the city to surrender. They wouldn't. So, of course, the Polish saw this. They were outraged, and then, they were ready to go to war the next day. All right. Thoughts and comments before I... Yeah.
Yeah, just thinking again with the things that people used to do and typical type of thing. I get when you do the army training for like Navy SEAL type of things, like that's why these are certain fields where I'm just saying certain activities or certain representations, certain things of we need to do this for not the actual purpose of what this thing is done. The army and the military, that's one of the things that you need to keep that the heck out of there. Like it needs to be the select of the select of the select. Like I'm not going to qualify for the army for very good reason. So we should lower the standards so we can get like more people who look like me or more women and things. It's another thing that I think part of why I'm saying I don't imagine this is happening, because I don't think people truly understand or truly think there's a chance of having wars. And then you have people in the West who are supposedly a lot more pro-women who are like trying to push to have as many women as possible join the army. Like, why do you want women to go and die in the wars? Probably because you don't think there'll ever actually be a war. Now, of course, you have countries like Israel where everybody's kind of enlisted into it for like 2 or 3 years after they hit 18 or something like that. Even South Korea is something. South Korea might just be the men. I'm not quite sure. I think it's mostly just the men. But you have certain countries like that where it's like the whole like you have to just join the forces. But otherwise, this whole idea of just like we just need to just have everybody like no, it's not. It's a recreational thing now. You have people just joining to get a degree, to get some money for college, to get a career. It's not necessarily because I want to be the most functional, severe, lethal fighting force in the world. It's something else now, and it's a sign of the times.
Yeah, because I remember like I've seen this and people have told me, they said like that's why Israelis can be some of the toughest people to work with, because the thing is they all have military training, including the women, so they're all like no BS, very stern, don't mess around,
Mm-hmm.
everything has to be right, all that. But it's like they're surrounded by countries that hate them, so it's like they kind of have to be.
Yeah, yeah. It's not an easy place to live in. Yeah.
So, all right. So, getting into September 12th, this is when the battle began. Again, Bin Laden chose the 11th because that's where, if certain decisions had been made, they might have turned things around. Um, so the battle started at 4 a.m. Charles of Lorraine. Lorraine had recently been annexed by the German. I'm trying to remember. I think it was taken back by France, because Alsace-Lorraine went back and forth between the German states and France. Today it's part of France, but I think at this point it was France. But they fought for the Holy Roman Empire. Um, he basically attacked with his force, taking several nearby villages. He attacked the Ottoman army from the left and the center. The Polish infantry was sent to attack them from the right flank. Kara Mustafar made some counterattacks, but he held back his elite Janissary forces. So, for those who don't know, the Janissaries were these elite troops. They were actually Christian children, usually from Greece, the
Yeah.
Balkans, sometimes Russia, who were. It's interesting. It's almost like a cross between a slave and special forces, because they were expected to do this. You couldn't get out of it. But if you if you succeeded Janissary training, you were considered respectable and given a certain pay and like place in society. And the Sultan himself was protected by Janissaries. Um, but it's like it was kind of an unusual situation because then they said some parents would actually offer up their kids to be in the Janissaries because it's like, oh, my son's a Janissary, we have access to these things now. So kind of an unusual situation. Yeah. You have any thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, it was. Um, of course, also back then you had to consider just people. If somebody is like from a family that's going through some struggles, that would happen. But then, of
Yeah.
course, it'd also be more like well-off families, like nobles. So it's like, you had like 10 kids.
Yeah.
Like a couple of them are going to be, this person's going to inherit this amount of the land. This is have a couple of girls that be married off. Oh, we have like the seventh son. Like, what's he going to do? Okay, let's put him as a janissary. It's kind of that type of thing. And then you have, of course,
Yeah.
you have the social cachet things, but also the janissaries. There were somebody. If you'd make it through the training, you'd be fed, you'd be cared for, you'd have a brotherhood, you'd
Yeah.
have some name. I don't know. Some of these, of course, with some of these, you're like not allowed to marry, at least while you're part of the actual thing. Or then you get to see the world. Maybe this person goes, and then after they're done being a janissary, they stop and they leave off in some other country somewhere. You might send letters back. But that was a kind of thing where this was. There was a lot of people who could just be professional mercenaries, who could just be professional
Yeah.
soldiers. Like, mercenary was
Yeah.
it wasn't even what they even called. Only like, I'm gonna check the etymology
Soldiers
of
of
mercenary now.
soldiers of fortune.
Soldiers of fortune.
Soldiers of
Yeah,
fortune.
I want
Yeah.
to check like the etymology of that term now. Yeah.
Sure. So basically, the Turks made one final effort to blow up the city walls. They tried to detonate a total of 10 mines, but the mines were discovered and disarmed before they could, which was very fortunate because the thing is, the Turks, with their numbers, if they had torn down those walls, they would have overwhelmed the garrison easily. So the Ottomans were basically trapped between imperial forces on the left and Poles on the right. Sobieski decided to deliver the final blow. So they unleashed this massive artillery barrage from atop the mountain, targeting what's called the Türkenschanze, which is basically, I forget how to translate, but it's Turk something in German, and it's basically like a few forts, mostly palisades, wood, and some tents, and it was kind of like their headquarters. It was supposed to protect the siege army from attacks. So they're deliberately firing on the Janissaries because those are the elite troops, so they want to take out as many as they can. And then the cavalry came out of the forest, and they reported historically that the Viennese garrison all cheered when they saw them come out because oh, finally we've been relieved after 2 months of siege or whatever. um so Sobieski led the largest cavalry charge in history. 3,000 winged hussars, 15,000 Holy Roman Empire cavalry, all heavily armored. So imagine just the
Wow.
largest cavalry charge in history flying down this mountain towards you. um the one movie I sent you, they don't do it super well, but it was a lower budget film, so I guess they had certain limitations. But my understanding is that historically they said they flew so fast down the mountain that Turkish soldiers were actually smashed to pieces, just getting hit by the horses because they were going so fast.
Now,
And you think you
people
would,
underestimate how massive a horse is. And horses are
yeah.
not small creatures; like they're massive beings. And then to have the armor on them and the speed, yeah. And also, people were
And
smaller back then. Like, these
yeah.
weak people who've been out there for battle. Yeah, you could get blasted
And
apart.
then you had these guys with these hulking suits of armor, the wings. There's different stories behind why they chose that. One story is that, well, I guess there were Hungarian mercenaries who had that design and they sort of copied it because they liked the way it looked. But then some people have said that when the horses rode down, the wind going through the feathers made kind of the sounds of like arrows falling, and that apparently like scared the horses. Some of that they debate whether it's legend or not because it also made like this loud clanking sound as they rode down. Um, I think I sent you a video. The Hussars, of course, are considered elite forces. Like their training was very rigorous. They usually had like two swords, a pistol, like all this stuff. Um, the combat, like with the Janissaries, was very brutal. Like you had to fight hand to hand, and you got beaten up. It was pretty intense. Um, the Hussars were actually in service up until 1776. Yeah, a lot going on that year between our country, but also that's when the Wealth of Nations was written. Because I sent you another video. It's not entirely related to this, but it gets into how the Swedish actually defeated the Hussars. Because at this time you had muskets which fired the round balls, but the thing was this: at this point, sorry, you had the arquebus, which was like an earlier musket. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but like it was kind of weak compared to a musket. So you would shoot it at armor, and sometimes the balls would just bounce off. But then the musket balls were powerful enough that they would actually pierce through the armor. So at some point they realized like there's no point in sending these guys with these heavy suits of armor because the musket balls just tear through them. And then, of course, once you have rifles, those tear through even more things. So it's like, what's the point? So then later on, Poland and other countries just started switching more to light cavalry, ambushing from the sides, things like that, because these guys in hulking suits of armor weren't really practical anymore. But they were in service a while, and it was pretty interesting. And I know the Hussars, they still sort of exist as like a ceremonial thing. Obviously they don't do combat. I know they have like elite Hussar tank divisions, things like that. So they're sort of preserved. I mean, every country does that to a degree. Like I know the Japanese have like elite samurai divisions. Obviously, they don't fight with swords, but they know all the hand-to-hand combat. Um, I was mentioning earlier the Swiss Guard. It's interesting. They still have the old uniforms on, but they carry Uzis as well as halberds, and they're trained in hand-to-hand combat as well. Because I was reading that when Pope John Paul II was shot, that's when they realized, like, okay, we need actual bodyguards, not just like ceremonial stuff. So the Swiss Guards can fight as well, but like they're a combination of sort of the old traditional thing and they can fight, but like nothing like the real Hussars really exists anymore. I think they said at some funerals, like they'll have guys dress up that way because it's like in honor of that, but it's not really. I mean, obviously, armored knights haven't been practical in a long time. Yeah. Any thoughts or comments before I continue?
Yeah, just another thing is just how common it was for you to expect that if you were, especially if you were a male, and you were supposed
Yeah.
to be a male to actually affect society outside of just controlling your own self. First of all, controlling your
Yeah.
own self, and had the responsibility of securing your own homestead and things like that. But to be out
Yeah.
there in society and active, in majority of the cases, it was a life or death thing. You had to be trained in some means to actually physically
Yeah.
impose yourself on somebody or prevent somebody physically imposing themselves on you. Now to transfer now to see the way men are complaining about, oh, society's doing this to us. Oh, the world is doing this. Oh, the laws are like this against us. I'm like, yeah, okay, the law is a bit biased here. Yes, we live in a gynocentric country. Yes, women have certain big expectations of this. Yes, you'll get looked at this way. You'll get called this. I'm like, but these are people calling you something. You don't have to date that woman. You don't have to marry that person in that kind of sense. What are you complaining about? Find a group of men that accept you for who you are. Go out there. I'm not saying that Jordan Peterson clean your room. It's a day. Ah, like there's someone who was talking about how like Jordan Peterson said something about saying you had to like Jordan Peterson said some other people and more in the political conservative right have said this thing about saying like it's your like if you don't want to reproduce, if you don't want to have a wife and kids, there's something wrong. It comes from depression. It comes from something. They're not saying you have to do something. Just because you want to do something doesn't mean you have to do the certain thing. So there's certain things you may want to do. You may actually look like this is not a situation, but the people are just like, I don't want to do this anymore. I can't see the point of having kids. I can't see the point of being a part of society. I don't necessarily get those people. I understand if people say, I want to do this, but I don't find ways where I think I can be positive, I can be successful at doing it. That's different than just saying, like, I'm giving up on it. I don't care about it. It's pointless. It's a social construct for me to want these things. Like, no, there's very positive reasons to do this. And as I mentioned, people have gone through a lot more than what we're actually dealing with now to actually achieve those things. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you have Danny Harper on Facebook, but he had a good post about this. I'm trying to find it, but he had a good line, something about people say, "Oh, I don't want to bring a kid into the world," and he's like, "This is really just a form of cowardice because it's
Yeah.
like, you're basically admitting like, oh, I'm just gonna give up rather than like, okay, I'm gonna navigate this as best I can." Yeah, I'll try
Yeah.
to find
And
the post, but it's
that that is part of the test. That is part of the test that comes upon us. Society is also testing you to see, are you in a position to navigate your society to get to a point where you can get a woman who you value enough to value you enough in that position. Even the women themselves. Is a woman in a position where she's able to navigate society enough and not just fall into the temptation of just free sex whenever, or oh, just focus on the job. A lot of people, and they're telling them, just go work, just focus on the job, have sex with many people. I've seen these tests where like, oh, this is how to have sex with people and not catch feelings. I'm like, women are getting those messaging, but then enough women still, I think majority of the women still navigate their way through that stuff and don't fall for that and actually find men. And majority of the men, I think, still today navigate their way through these pitfalls and things like that and still get to a position where they can actually be somewhat functional and somewhat strong and active in that sense. Yeah, and also here with like
so.
mercenary. Go
Oh, sorry,
ahead.
go ahead. Well,
Yeah,
so
just Go ahead.
Here is a quote. He says, "I'm not bringing a kid into a world like this as a coward's cope. Just say you're scared you can't protect and provide for them."
Yeah. And for some people, they can't. Not everybody can be a winged hussar. Some people are just the peasants working on the farm, and the people getting hit by and yeah, that's how it is for me. Like I haven't been in a position yet where I can feel like I can. Doesn't mean I think it's pointless. Doesn't mean I'm telling people not to do it. I'm just saying I personally haven't been able to get myself into a position where I'm confident to do that. Doesn't mean I think there's no way I can get to that position. I can do more to get to that position, and hopefully in the future I can do it. And I encourage people to find ways to do that in their own sphere, in their own understanding. But here with Mercenary from etymology.com, ety.org, and all these things that Stephen is talking about, there'll be an article linked at the bottom where you're reading this to get these links and the things that we're referring to here. It says late 14th century mercenary, one who works for only for hire, one who has no higher motive to work than love of gain. An old French mercenary hireling, 13th century, a direct from Latin mercenarius, one who does anything for pay, literally, hired, paid, from merces, genitive mercedes, pay and reward wages for mercs, wares or merchandise, and sea market, and then specifically a professional soldier in a foreign service by mid-17th century. So they mean foreign service. So you can't necessarily be a mercenary for your own country or your own nation state. So it's like whenever you go to somewhere else, you can be a mercenary. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. All right. So now this was interesting, and they show this in one of the scenes. So Kara Mustafar, the Crimean Khanate, had fought with the Turks. So for those who don't know, Genghis Khan had conquered the Crimea, and as the empire started to fracture, a lot of these different elements started to break up into their own factions. So the Crimea was actually ruled by Mongols for some time who converted to Islam. It was the Crimean Khanate. So the leader was the Khan. So he actually had a number of soldiers, and he ordered the Crimean Khan to protect their left flank, but the Khan instead basically just told his troops to leave. And there's debate about like what happened. Like he had issues with Kara Mustafar. He saw the hussars and cavalry coming and basically said, "I'm not going to sacrifice my men," all that. So they basically ran away instead of protecting the Turkish left flank. Now, some people said had they stayed, they still would have lost anyway. It would have been more casualties on the Christian side, but it wouldn't have made that much of a difference. So the Viennese garrison also sallied forth and joined in the battles. The Turkish soldiers panicked. Many of them scattered. Kara Mustafar actually escaped. Some of them actually drowned in the river because they just, they panicked and ran in different directions. Some of them had armor that weighed them down. So some Holy League troops entered the city. So King Sobieski said, he paraphrased Julius Caesar's famous quote, only he said, I think in classical Latin, this is Venimus, vidimus, Deus vicit, which means we came, we saw, God conquered. And they say General Starhemberg was said to have hugged and kissed Sobieski because he was so happy at finally being saved after 2 months of siege. Then I was going to get into the aftermath. Did you have any comments before I?
Something like this is again with the truth. It's like somebody look at someone like a Hillary Clinton, whether you like her or not, whether you think she's a good person or not, and things like this. I believe she believes she's a good person. I believe she believes her being in position of power is going to benefit her, of course, but she also has convinced herself that it would also be a greater benefit for the rest of the world. I don't think she truly thinks Bill Clinton is like the best man for her personally in a romantic sense, but she came to that calculation. She said, yes, this is a lecherous man. He's done all these things, but we have the history coming up in Arkansas with our political machinations together. It wasn't, it was one of those older type of marriages back in those kings and queens times where they're like, we're getting married for more than just reproducing and raising a functional child. It was like, it's a political marriage. We understand we have similar goals outside of just being a family and things like that. If it was just reproduction, they could have found, both of them could have found people that fit them in a better way. So she made the calculation, I've invested this much into him, I'm not going to drop him over the Monica Lewinsky thing. So there was those kind of considerations. She's somebody who I think has studied enough for things like this. She believes she's this kind of historical being. And this, we came, we saw. There was a thing she said about Gaddafi. We came, we saw, he died. That was the thing she laughed
Ha
about.
ha ha
Like,
ha ha.
yeah, it's like haha laughing about. Because for her, that's the kind of, I can imagine her imagining herself in this kind of sense. And then of course there's people on the political left who do hold her in that kind of sense and things like
Yeah.
that. But we also mentioned here with the Crimea, that's the area that was taken over, that is in again in the news in this Ukraine-Russia kind of situation.
Yeah.
And this is also what I keep talking about. Like, if you keep going back, should we, if you're saying, okay, we need to give Crimea back to Ukraine, should we give it back to the Khan because the Khan had it before? Like, how far back do you go with this whole thing? Like, we need to give it back to these people because these people had it first. Like, how far back do you take that kind of thing? And it kind of gets us bogged down that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't remember all the history, but I know with the Mongols, like shortly after Genghis died, like it started to break apart because you had his son Ogadai, who wasn't the oldest, but he was one of the most competent. He was actually a very skilled commander, but had a drinking problem, so he drank himself to death. And then when he died, I know like things kind of fell apart because it was like, okay, who should take over? And then this became the Golden Horde, this became the Crimean Khan, this became the I think Yuan dynasty that ruled China, and it just kind of like broke up because there was no leader that could really unite everything again. All right.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, it shows how long his legacy lasted because this is 1600s and he started, I want to say, what, 12, 1300s. So, this lasted a while.
Yeah.
All right. So the aftermath, Kara Mustafa escaped. The Sultan had it, but the Sultan had him executed for his failure. He was executed by strangulation via a silk rope pulled by the Janissary command in Belgrade, Serbia on Christmas Day later that year.
Was
Apparently,
this one of those executions that was set aside for noblemen or for like wealthier
yeah,
people who had different sorts
yeah,
of things? Yeah.
yeah. Because I know the Mongols had that rule where you couldn't spill nobleman blood, so
Yeah.
they would do things like molten silver. They'd have them trampled to death, things like that. Um, so I guess the Janissary command strangled him with the silk rope. What I heard was that when the Sultan found out the battle was lost, he basically said, "I want his head like right away." But it was like later that year that he was killed. Um, the Christians took a lot of loot. They found all these different, camels, different spices, all this stuff. The Pope called Sobieski the savior of Western European civilization. The Turks never attacked Vienna again. The next few years, they actually liberated Hungary. They took back the Balkans too, but I guess the Turks reclaimed them later. I think this was the start of liberating Romania as well, which was under the Turkish rule too. This was basically the beginning of the end of the Ottoman Empire. They did last a bit longer because they were broken up after World War I, which you figure was, over 200 years later. But they were already sort of in decline from the losses to Russia, and then this sort of cemented it. And then from this point on, it was just gradually losing territory, shrinking back to modern day Turkey, and eventually after World War I, they were just broken up entirely. That was pretty much it. And then, like I say, it broke. Islam never advanced that far into Europe again. And thoughts and comments before I continue?
Yeah, so again, with September 11th, so they figured that was the turning point. That occasion was the turning point where it's like they were just at the cusp. If this ride of the Hussars hadn't happened,
Yeah.
they think Islam would have had the caliphate would have spread across Europe. Is that the general estimation of some Muslims today? Or just not
Well,
even just Muslims, even just historians who are looking at this who would say that might have been a linchpin kind of situation.
well, possibly, but seizing Vienna would have been important because it would have controlled that river, those trade routes, and it would have given them staging ground to go further into Europe, and then eventually, Germany, France, Rome, of course, was what they wanted ultimately because you take out the Catholic Church, all these factions lose their overlord, and then can spread through Europe. But again, it's like had they succeeded in taking Vienna, would they have been defeated later? Who knows? But my understanding is that was like they were already sort of in decline, but this was it for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you got to think, like, also with Europe, you look at the countryside, people look at it, like, oh, this is great, well, these little castles and things. But you also got to think, like, some of these castles were built once Europe was relatively united. At least it was,
Yeah.
Italy was Italy, France was France. Some of these countries were still like the countries themselves. It wasn't back in this whole times was like principalities and tribals. So why do they need so many castles? Well, because there's still like raids on a regular basis.
Yeah.
So you had to have the townsfolk actually go into the castle and actually hide in the castle because like people used to come and raid and just carry off people, slaves, and for concubines and things like that. That used to be a common type of thing. That was this. The strife continued. So even if you did have these massive wars, there was still still a lot of antagonism between the people in this region.
Yeah.
Something I haven't looked into, but how much yes, with the Mongols and things like that, there's some influence in there. But how much actual um, warfare was there between Middle East and Asian countries? Like, they go east that much, or is it mostly coming
Well,
to Europe?
yeah, so the Mongols actually made it as far as Egypt, but they were defeated. I'm trying to remember if it was the Battle of the Pyramids. I think that was the name. They were defeated by Mamluks. They actually made it pretty far into Europe. They fought with the Teutonic Knights and Hungarians. I watched a video recently about how the Hungarians defeated them because the Mongols were very agile, but they could still use castles to sort of lure them close and hit them,
Mhm.
different things like that. And I also think it was a combination of the Mongols just not having strong leadership after Genghis, but also Ogadai died as well. So they, it was just really hard for them to sort of take over again. But I mean, they made it as far as Egypt. I mean, I think they invaded India at one point. Um, they attacked Constantinople, but they never took, well, Istanbul, but they never took it. Well, no, sorry. It was Constantinople because, yeah, they fought with the Byzantine Empire, but they never succeeded in taking them.
Yeah.
They made it pretty far, but they wondered, like, had Ogadai not drank himself to death or had there been another strong leader, like, could they have kept going? Like, who knows?
So that was how far Asia came. But then I'm wondering how far did like the sultans and people like that go into Asia? Because when you have like Indonesia is the most populous, I think actually, yeah, Indonesia is the most populous Muslim country in the world. Then Egypt is second. So with Indonesia, was that more just the religion going on? Like when you talk about Pakistan, this place, Pakistan is like in Asia. So people say it's Middle
Yeah,
East, yeah, that's fucking Asia. It's Asia. Of course, like
yeah.
India is like a significant amount of Muslim population. Was that due to just the religion going by itself, or was that due to actual warfare coming in, like spreading Islam by the sword and things like that?
That's a good question, actually. I don't know that part of history because I know like Buddhism was an interesting case because it started in India, but they all left and then it became dominant elsewhere. But that's sort of like, as you got it earlier, Christianity started in the Middle East, but it became strong in Europe. And then they
Mhm.
say today Africans and South Americans are more religious than a lot of Westerners.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah,
uh,
it was very, very Christian, very strong Christianity here. Yeah, and also I think South Korea is one of the strongest, most Christian. They send the most missionaries per capita in the world.
yeah. So, yeah, I'm not sure about Indonesia. I haven't really looked into that history, but
All
worth
right.
looking into. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so I was just going to say some further reading sources and cultural impact. There's a Sabaton song, "The Winged Hussars." I sent you two videos. One is the lyrics. The other is there's a few fan-made videos, different quality. The one I sent you is the one I really like.
Okay.
Um, it's good because it sort of details the different events, and then they show them portrayed using the movie, but also documentary footage. Like, okay, like they're starving them out. Okay, they try to blow up the city walls. Then of course, the Hussars finally arrived, counterattack. So that movie I've been referencing, it's called The Day of the Siege, September 11th, 1683. Again, I've had trouble getting a hold of it. I saw there was that Catholic group that pushed for it to be available. It's on Amazon, but it's DVD only. So if you have a DVD player, you can buy it. You can't download or rent it directly. There's probably some sites, but kind of skeptical about those. So I don't know if you've heard this story, but they say that the invention of the croissant was actually inspired by this because
Oh.
the legend was that, well, it was Austrian bakers in Paris, and the name in French it's actually, I think it's like Viennois or something like that. Like it looks like Viennese, and the legend is that when the Turks were digging tunnels under the city walls, the bakers who woke up early heard the sounds and went and reported it to the garrison. So because they went to work so early, they were the first people who noticed. And had they not done that, the Turks would have succeeded in tunneling and blown up the walls, and the city would have been lost. So some people say that's where the croissant came from. It's crescent moon over the victory over the Turks, their flag and all. Um, the Lord of the Rings, the Ride of the Rohirrim was actually based off this. And if you think about it, if you look at some of their armor, like the style of the helmets and stuff, if you
Mhm.
remember the Battle of Helm's Deep, like, they're losing, but then all of a sudden this cavalry charge just comes down the mountain and wipes
Yeah.
out, the much larger force. And Tolkien, of course, was very Christian, so he was inspired by this too. Um, and then I've been reading some stuff, could even be other discussions, but about Poland's role in the other wars, like in the Revolutionary War. I was reading how Kazimierz Pulaski trained our cavalry, and how there was the Battle of Brandywine, which was an American defeat, but apparently he provided enough divergence that Washington and Lafayette, who was wounded, could escape. And then, like, had he not done that, they might have been captured, and of course, the war would have gone completely differently. And I know with Pulaski, he unfortunately died during the war. He was injured, but he's been called the father of the American cavalry because he trained our cavalry. And I remember when he died, Lafayette himself actually laid down a cornerstone in honor of him because
Oh.
he inadvertently saved his life. So sort of like, thanks. Then there was
This is the same person from
Kokshiuku.
Lafayette Park.
Yeah, Lafayette, Marquis de Lafayette, the French general. He was 22 at the time, but he commanded all these troops. And then he's got an interesting story too. He was the one who he went back to France, and I guess he was inspired by what he saw here. So, like Bastille Day, when that happened, he was actually the one commanding the troops that stormed the Bastille because he was inspired by what he saw here. But then, when things got really out of control, he fled France, then got captured because he helped overthrow the monarchy. But at the same time, he had to leave France because things just got so chaotic. He didn't want to get killed himself. So,
Yeah. Oh,
really interesting guy. Napoleon said that in his wars that the Polish were some of the best lancers he had. I know in the Battle of Madrid they actually took out 4 rows of cannon for him. Um, they served as auxiliary units and whatever. And then there's some stuff in World War II that's interesting. Even though Poland lost the war, um, they served in other forces. There were the Free Polish divisions, kind of like the Free French divisions. They fought alongside the Allies. Um, I didn't know until recently, but there was actually a very prominent Royal Air Force squadron, the 303rd. It was called the Kokshiuku Squadron. The head of the RAF actually said, had it not fought, they said the Battle of Britain might have gone differently because after Britain was attacked, they were looking for pilots. So a lot of the Poles who fled were like, okay, fine, we'll join the Air Force and take
yeah,
up
that's what people
arms.
need to understand. Yeah, just because the
A lot
country
of
is taken over doesn't mean like the army, the military itself was completely subservient to that country. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of Czechs did as well. So people forget that like a lot of the RAF was made up of Czechs, Poles, and other people, because it's like, oh, they're probably Free French too, because you figure like, okay, we still want to fight, like we're better off over here, where at least like, okay, we're not going to
Yeah.
get captured and executed. Um, so then there was some other stuff too. Like I don't know if you know about the Battle of Monte Cassino, but that was this monastery that was seized on the way to Rome. It was really like a bloodbath of a battle. Like you could kind of compare it to like Omaha Beach, where it was this like entrenched monastery that soldiers had to climb through and get shot at from cover and all that. Um, but it was a Free Polish division that ultimately captured that. And then of course Poland has been our allies in most of these wars as well. So it's kind of interesting because I mean, Poland has lost a bunch of wars, but they've kind of had this underdog role too that a lot of people forget. And I mean, in this
Polish
particular,
jokes when I was or in high school, a bunch
yeah.
of Polish jokes. Yeah.
But then you figure in this war, they were commanding the troops, and like it was kind of messed up because someone I saw wrote the comment like, "Oh, Poland saves Austria from occupation." Then years later, it's okay. Russia, Prussia, and Austria say, "Let's divide up Poland." It's like, thanks guys. It's like we save your country, and years later. Um, but I was telling somebody recently, I think the problem with Poland, they say, is it's, I mean, it's surrounded by hostile countries, but it's also very hard to defend because there's only a few rivers. It's very flat. There aren't many mountains. Whereas, like, Switzerland, you run and hide in the Alps. They say Italy is actually a defender's country because you have Alps in the north. The coastlines are narrow and hard to land on. Sicily has all these areas you can hide in and ambush people. But Poland, they say it's very hard to defend. And again, being surrounded by people who they haven't gotten along with, it's easy to take over. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Oh,
Aside, I think that's about it. Yeah, I don't have much else. If you want to add anything at
yeah,
this time.
no, that's been an enjoyable conversation. For guys, gals, and everybody else in between who's been listening, thank you all for very much for listening. Stephen has mentioned a few things there. There will be links below to these articles and content and things he said. If there's anything that he suggested that you would like him to go more into, I'm more willing to have these conversations with him about the different topics and things like that. If you've enjoyed this conversation series, it's good to break from our from our being a chauvinistic, seeming like chauvinistic pigs, talking about things. We had like a marry him series we're not finished with. Had different topics that I need to edit and post. This conversation I had on student loans. I've had a bunch of conversations with Stephen about a whole bunch of different topics, a wide range. You were talking about the croissant here. Surprised that didn't come up when you're talking in the food series that we had. You are what you consume. But yeah, so this is this. Anything else that you thought of?
I mean, some of these other things could be other topics. Like I said, we can do a separate topic on medieval and Jan Žižka. Maybe in the future do a more. I'd have to compile more stuff, but about Poland's roles in these other wars and things too. That was just some stuff off the top of my head, but I'm sure like if I delved into it, there's probably more stuff to find.
Hmm.
Again, yeah, we'll get back to food stuff, but that's another thing. So,
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's it for
yeah,
us. And there you can see how like history knocks down. Maybe in the future, hopefully not, like there's not some other violent thing that takes over the 9/11 date and things like that. But
mm,
this is a bit of history. It's a bit of history, and I want to thank Stephen for taking his time to share this with us. And thank you all out there for listening.
yeah. Thank you very much.
So guys, gals, and everybody else in between, goodbye.
Bye bye.